welcome to the deep dive. If you feel like the political landscape is, well, fracturing, you're not wrong. Today, we're taking a deep dive into what sources confirm is a really profound and accelerating social shift that's reshaping everything. Global politics, culture, and maybe most fundamentally, the entire future structure of society.
It is a huge topic.
It is. We're looking at this rapidly widening gap in political ideology between young men and young women, and this is happening all across the developed world. The central phenomenon we're investigating is this. In major countries, from East Asia to Western Europe and the U.S., young women are moving sharply to the liberal or left end of the spectrum.
Right.
While at the same time, young men are moving just as sharply toward the conservative or right end.
And it's that simultaneous opposite movement that's key.
Exactly. It's creating this ideological chasm in the rising generation that really has very few historical parallels.
That's the critical point.
No.
Our mission today is to, analyze the source data that clearly documents this specific trend in places like South Korea, Germany, the UK, and the US.
Okay.
We have to go beyond just saying, oh, there's a gap. We need to really explore why this gender-based divergence in ideology is about so much more than just who they vote for.
It's deeper.
It is. It signifies a fundamental split in how the next generation sees the world, fairness, society, even reality itself.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Before we zoom in on the data, which is pretty stark, we need to establish the coordinates, so to speak.
Terms.
Yeah, the terms. When we say left or right ideology, we know those labels can mean wildly different things in, say, Seoul versus London.
Of course.
But the sources show the core philosophical values driving these movements are strikingly consistent globally.
Precisely. And to stay impartial, we just look at the core tenets. So on the left, or the liberal side, the emphasis is heavily on social equality, group welfare,
right,
reform and progress.
Right, building a better society.
Exactly. This view typically supports a more active government role in fixing societal problems. Things like guaranteeing civil rights, ensuring public services, or policies to reduce wealth disparity.
So the idea is that systemic barriers are the main obstacle.
That's the general idea, yes.
And then when we look at the right or the conservative perspective, how does the source material define those core drivers?
So the right tends to emphasize individual freedom, order, and stability, often rooted in traditional values and cultural practices.
Okay.
This perspective usually advocates for limited government. It strongly favors free market economics, and it places a high value on maintaining existing social structures.
And the belief there is more about individual responsibility.
Individual responsibility is often seen as the primary driver of outcomes, yes.
So what's fascinating here is that the conflict isn't that these two philosophies exist. I mean, they've always existed.
Oh.
The key discovery is this simultaneous opposite movement, specifically within that 18 to 29 age group, that's causing the distance between the two sides to just accelerate.
And widen. It's not a regional anomaly. The sources are very clear. They call this a global phenomenon.
And that age focus is everything.
It is. The sources really emphasize that this divergence is most pronounced and therefore most predictive in that 18 to 29-year-old generation.
So these are the people who are going to be shaping things for decades.
Absolutely. They're signaling the future trajectory of politics and culture, especially as they enter their peak earning and voting years.
Okay, so let's look at the map. You mentioned South Korea, Germany, the UK, the US. They all show clear evidence of this trend. Before we get to the most extreme example, what do the sources tell us about the, let's say, the size of the shift in Western democracies like the US or the UK?
Well, even in Western nations, the gap is already significant. For instance, in the US and the UK, we see young women registering far more liberal viewpoints than young men.
And it's growing.
It's expanding rapidly. The sources indicate that young women have been moving leftward since the early 2010s, but the really dramatic shift has been young men either, holding steady on the right or actively moving further right.
Especially since when?
Particularly since the mid-2010s.
Yeah.
We're talking about a generation where the difference in ideological identification between the genders can be more than 20 or 30 percentage points.
That's huge. That creates massive political segmentation.
It does.
A 20 to 30 point gap is already a massive challenge for governance. But the sources highlight one nation where this has reached, almost unbelievable levels. It signals the potential end game of this trend.
And this is where it gets really interesting.
It does.
We have to zoom in on South Korea. According to the research, it currently has the most significant ideological polarization among all the nations studied.
So it's the perfect case study.
It really is. It helps us understand the trend's most dramatic impact.
Can you walk us through the specific data points? Because they are striking.
Absolutely. So the ideological shift among young women in South Korea was decisive and fast. Their liberal proportion sharply increased by up to 25%.
Plus 25%. Wow.
They moved decisively to the left, likely in response to social and economic pressures.
And at the same time, the reaction from young men was the complete opposite.
It was. Young men's liberal proportion sharply decreased. This was a steep movement toward conservatism, which resulted in a swing of nearly 50% away from that liberal position.
Minus 50%.
They aren't just staying put. They are actively moving in the opposite direction of their female peers.
Wait a minute. So if you have young women shifting plus 25% toward liberal and young men shifting minus 50% away from it, you add that up and you get an ideological difference of about 75 percentage points between the two genders in that 18 to 29 bracket.
That's the math.
That sounds less like a disagreement and more like two completely different cultures emerging.
Yeah.
What are the key factors the sources point to for this huge divergence?
The sources point to several interwoven factors. They're specific to South Korea, but they have echoes globally.
Oh.
For young women, you have the rise of strong feminist movements, plus high educational attainment, but still facing workplace inequality. That fueled the push toward the left's focus on reform and equity.
And for the men?
Well, for young men, the perception of reverse discrimination, intense competition for jobs, and cultural expectations like mandatory military service led many to embrace conservatism.
Which promises what? Stability.
Stability, order, and a defense of traditional gender roles against what they perceive as threats to their status.
So the 75-point difference isn't just a political preference. It's reflecting completely different lived experiences and different reactions to inequality.
That's right. This opposite movement creates what the sources call an unprecedented antagonistic structure.
Antagonistic, that's a strong word.
It is. It demonstrates a level of separation that goes way beyond traditional political rivalry. It predicts an extremely high risk of polarization in future politics because the basic assumptions about society are now split along gender lines.
And they're fundamentally opposed. That degree of separation is truly staggering. So if the gap is this wide and it's widening, let's transition to the deeper implications. Is this just about who they vote for, or does it run deeper into their daily lives?
And this is the critical next step in understanding this. The sources are clear. The division extends far beyond a simple political choice or party lines.
Right.
This structural split has three major, profound impacts that are already reshaping society.
Okay, let's start with the first one you mentioned earlier, future political polarization risk. We hear that phrase a lot, but how does gender make this uniquely difficult to manage?
The problem is that gender cuts across every other demographic. It's everywhere. When your core values are split along gender lines, it makes dialogue and compromise so much more difficult.
Because the fault line is inescapable.
Exactly. You can, move neighborhoods to escape class division. But gender is embedded in every social interaction. So if half the rising generation sees the world through a lens of group equity and the other half prioritizes traditional order and individual liberty,
How do you agree on anything?
you can't. Achieving social consensus on almost any major issue, education policy, healthcare, it becomes nearly impossible. Governance just grinds to a halt.
That makes the divisions feel so permanent. And, we often frame political divides in economic terms, rich versus poor, class warfare.
Traditionally, yes.
But the sources highlight a second critical impact, that this trend transcends traditional economic division. What does that mean in practice?
Well, historically, political fault lines were often clear lines tied to wealth or class. Think labor versus capital.
Right.
But the data indicates this new ideological divergence is a powerful, independent dividing line. It not only coexists with economic factors, but often it overrides them.
So people will align with their gendered identity group, even if it's not in their economic self-interest.
We're seeing exactly that. The alignment is based on values and identity. And it transforms the whole debate. It stops being a conflict about resources or what we own, and it becomes a conflict about identity and beliefs. It becomes about who we are.
And that just fundamentally elevates the stakes. It's one thing to negotiate a tax rate, but it's another thing entirely to negotiate someone's entire concept of fairness or their self-worth.
It leaves very little room for compromise.
And that leads directly to the third and maybe the most critical issue the sources identify, fundamental worldview and value opposition.
This is the core engine driving the whole phenomenon. Young men and women are increasingly operating on fundamentally different, moral and social operating systems.
What are the practical differences in those operating systems?
They are diverging on basic ideas of justice, rights, societal responsibility, even how to define an ideal society.
Can you give an example?
Sure. A liberal operating system focuses heavily on identifying and dismantling systemic barriers to equality, so policies prioritize reform and equity. A conservative operating system tends to prioritize individual merit and existing structures, so they see those same policies as maybe unfair intrusions on liberty or order.
So they're processing the same facts about society.
And reaching diametrically opposed conclusions because their baseline moral assumptions are just different.
The sources used a really strong phrase for this. They said the two groups could potentially be living in two parallel universes.
It's a powerful metaphor, and it's used to underscore the severity of this separation. In a real parallel universe, you share the physical space, but the laws of reality are different.
Right.
Here, young men and women share the same country, the same institutions, but they operate under different laws of social justice, history, and gender roles. Dialogue becomes less about disagreement and more about just fundamentally misunderstanding the other side's reality.
That makes perfect sense. If you start from different places on what society should look like, stability versus equity, for example, you'll never agree on a solution. And the sources use this really striking analogy to summarize the trajectory. It's not just the gap, it's the acceleration.
They describe it like two accelerating parallel trains. They started on the same track, but now they're moving forward side by side, one constantly tilting left, the other constantly tilting right.
And the distance between the tracks?
It represents their values and worldviews.
Yeah.
It's constantly and quickly widening. And because of that acceleration, the potential for them ever to converge again becomes more remote every year.
It's the acceleration that implies the gap won't close on its own. It needs some kind of structural shift. So if we connect all this for the listener, what is the key takeaway from this deep dive?
I think the synthesis is clear. The young generation is being shaped by a core ideological fault line based on gender. Women moving left, men moving right.
And this isn't just a political trend that will swing back.
No. The sources describe this as a profound structural change that is rapidly undermining social cohesion and the ability of democratic societies to function through consensus.
The sources suggest this divergence impacts everything from education to economic policy. And that brings us to the final provocative thought for you to consider. If the fundamental operating systems for viewing the world are diverging this quickly, what does this imply for basic interpersonal dynamics? Specifically, what are the challenges this widening chasm poses for forming stable, long-term relationships and family structures, especially when the gap is 75 percentage points wide? That is a question to mull over long after this deep dive ends. Thank you for joining us today as we explore the global gender ideology gap and its potential structural implications. We encourage you to continue exploring this topic and the sources that inform this research.